like to welcome you all to our honors evening for late October. We have 4 presentations this evening, and as you're going to hear about, they run the gamut of topics: psychology, business, medicine, Bible, all sorts of things, which showcases, I think, in a very real way, the broad interests of the students in the honors program. And this is a night where they get to showcase their work, explain their ideas, and talk about the kind of things that they've been exploring really on their own. So I'd like to welcome not only them, but also the panelists who will be asking questions, and everyone else who is in the audience. We have 4 presenters tonight, and seeing as how we don't really want to be here an infinite amount of time, we are going to allocate about 30 minutes to each presenter, 15 minutes for the presentation, and about 15 minutes for the question and answer session. So questions have been prepared, the students have their papers ready to go, and without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Allison, who is going to tell us about psychology and business and everything in between. So let's welcome her.
Well, good evening, and thank you all for being here. It means so much to see such a large crowd at these honors presentations. We really enjoy doing this work, and we love sharing ideas with you guys. So thank you guys for coming. In the spring semester, I was focusing my honors work and my study on the importance of understanding diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, programs at a corporation level. And this semester, I really wanted to narrow the scope of that discussion by directing this presentation specifically on neurodiversity in the workplace. Now, neurodiversity is sort of a catch-all term that represents the difference in perception and experiences of individuals as they interact with the world, specifically in regards to variations in brain function and cognitive abilities. And the key word there is the difference. It's not a deficiency. And that's kind of the main idea of neurodiversity. It rejects the former view of individuals with diagnoses like autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, dyslexia, and a variety of other learning disabilities as being something deficient in that individual. Rather, the goal is to emphasize that the disorders are a result of natural variations in genetic sequencing. Just as we have differences in eye color and height due to variations in our genetics, there exist different perceptual experiences of the world due to biological components that form our thoughts and dictate our behavior. Now, I understand that neurodiversity can sound like a banal example of business jargon that is just prepackaged to be tossed into our DEI statement on our website. However, this really represents something much more fundamental, because labeling individuals with titles that imply ability can damage the individual's self-image and also hinder their prospects in the workplace due to that stigma. And for the purpose of this presentation, we're going to focus specifically on autism spectrum disorder as it serves as a lens for understanding neurodiversity as a whole. Because autism reflects neurological differences rather than deficiencies, as I mentioned, employers have a moral and practical responsibility to design workplace environments that empower neurodivergent employees to maximize their potential. And to see this, we will explore the psychological roots and the lived experiences of autistic people before we apply those concepts to the workplace. So the term autism was first used by Eichorn in 1943, and it was developed from the Greek roots auto, which means self, and ismos, which means the state or condition. So the word autism implies a sense of self-isolation and social withdrawal. And the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or the DSM-5 for short, characterizes autism spectrum disorder by a wide range of criteria, including difficulty with social interactions, repetitive patterns of behavior, restricted interests, and difficulty with time management, among a lot of other things, of course. But in addition, the autism should manifest in a child's early development stage, and so it should be present in that individual even if it matures or changes a little bit as they grow older. Now, as a psychology major, I want to be able to stand up here, point out the cause of autism, tell you why it develops, and point to the major brain structures involved. However, as of 2025, there is no known cause of autism. There have been innumerable studies that have sought to explain autism, and theories have circulated since the first mention of the term. Actually, one of the first hypotheses that was created to explain autism was created by Bruno Bettelheim, who described the parents of children with autism as being cold and unattached, and determined that this must have caused autism in their children. And so he coined the term refrigerator parenting to describe the cause of autism. Now, of course, that seems very harsh intervention to manage their symptoms because they're so insignificant to their day-to-day lives. And actually, 46% of people with autism have normal or above average intelligence, which underscores the fact that a great number of autistic individuals have the mental and cognitive capacities that are equal to or exceeding their their neurotypical peers, meaning that ASD does not inherently inhibit achievement. And many studies on the subject have found that individuals with autism can excel in the workplace and even provide a competitive advantage to employers due to their unique capacity for analysis and innovation. impacting their mental health. And so it could be many causes for that. The essay itself didn't specify what the causes for that mental distress could be. It could be stigma around being an autistic person, or it could even be just normal stresses of work. Anytime anything's stressful for us, we also feel a decrease in our mental health. So it could be something as simple as that. I'm not sure the exact cause of their increase in mental distress, but things like I mentioned, interventions and accommodations are designed to help those people so that when they do get a job, and even helping them get a job, that when they do get a job, they'll be more comfortable at work and it won't be such a tax on their mental health.
In schools for kids who are neurodivergent, is there any sort of, in your research, you come across any program that helps them understand or be able to adapt more to normal workday life?
Yes. Yes, there are classes and a lot of resources out for people who are neurodivergent. I mean, there's lots of universities that provide different, I think try to find the best intervention for people. They're doing lots of studies, and so they'll bring people in for those studies. And a lot of times they're effective. And one of the most effective things that I've seen is scripting, which I didn't mention as part of what the employers can do to help, but it can also be done through different third parties. And scripting is it's basically practicing the conversation. And so that I'm not surprised by what you say, and I kind of have an idea of what's happening in this conversation. And so scripting can give them a mental set to figure out, okay, I can function more easily because of this. And so that'd be my answer to that. Did that answer your question? Okay.
I think when you talked about like intelligence being very similar to neurodivergent individuals, it's just kind of different social things. I wonder if AI, like in your research, was there any AI that was used by workplaces that can kind of bridge the gap between like communicating with AI, which is less socially daunting many times, and then like the AI can communicate their ideas more effectively and kind of bridge the gap between the two.
That's actually a great application of AI. I haven't seen any research on that, and likely because it's such a new thing, I haven't done thorough research on it. But I think that would be extremely helpful for neurodivergent individuals, even just communicating through email. And any sort of written language is a lot easier for specifically people with autism, just because they don't have to worry about, are you using sarcasm? What are the social cues that I'm missing? So instead of having to worry about that, they can trust, okay, what's in the written word is true, and so I can go based off of this. So something like AI would help for sure.
What you were saying, you mentioned scripting as like a possible option. What do you see businesses spend on DEI efforts like this, and like what kind of impact on businesses like this?
I did a lot of that sort of research on my last presentation, and I don't remember the numbers on the spending, but it was definitely increased in the past couple of years. And then at the beginning of this year, there was a couple of legislation things that sort of changed that and have ended a couple of programs. But of course, all the businesses today are really conscious of DEI, even if we have no funding for it. I even interviewed in my last presentation at one of the human resource managers for Six Flags Over Texas, and she mentioned that they had a word for DEI, but it wasn't anybody's primary job. They weren't paid for being on that board, and it was kind of a nominal position. And so I didn't have that a whole lot in this research, but sometimes those things are just very underfunded, despite being very prevalent on like their mission statement and things like that.
You mentioned I things like the scripting that show very positive results when I talk about dealing with interactions like with police in your paper. Are there like studies of companies that are reporting the effects that those are having in their companies themselves? Is there a lot of data at that point already?
Most of the data comes from laboratory settings, unfortunately. That was a really good study. I'll mention it briefly because I didn't mention it in my presentation. But to facilitate police interactions, they brought in people with autism, and then they gave them this was called a blue envelope. And then they put all of their legal documents in it, and anything that they would need in just a routine traffic stop. And so whenever they were pulled over by the police, they could pull that out, and it had a list of instructions and some things for me to say, some things for the officer to say, and so that the officer understood, okay, this person isn't like avoiding eye contact because any number of reasons, but they have this document and they're autistic the police were better able to work with the person with autism. People with autism felt way more comfortable. And so all of these studies kind of showed that if in real life application, these sort of scripting things can be helpful, then we could also apply that to business. But businesses don't usually do different studies like this, and I didn't come across any like that in my research if there were any, that because it's so effective in day-to-day interactions, it applies very well to the business setting.
I think we have time to work over that. David, you got a second one?
You mentioned repeatedly about employers needing to make the workplace accessible for people with just neurodivergent in general. And something I was thinking about as reading your paper is that it seems to me, and I don't really know if this is where the question comes from, that a lot of times these people are able to do some things far better than the normal person. And part of me wonders if one thing that would help would be to place them in positions where they are far separate from the normal workplace, because it leans into what they're able to do far better than what your average person is able to do. And if that is both, that would then be beneficial for both the company and the person. That's something that's come up.
Yes, and that's why I mentioned, there was an article I found that mentioned that people with autism can be a competitive advantage for a business. And a lot of that does go into the selection and the placement of employees and making sure that they go to a place where they're going to thrive. So if this is someone who's, like you said, highly intelligent, highly capable, and super great at data analytics, then you can put them in that position and they're going to do way better there than if you try to put them anywhere else in the company. And so a lot of it does come into the hiring process. And in my paper, I mostly focus on training employees that you already have. But yes, I think that if we could also focus on the hiring process and making sure that we pick people for the job that are going to be very well suited for that position, including people who are neurodiverse, then that would be a very positive impact on the community.
You talked about the study of some of the causes, and then also kind of like the misinformation of the public of things like that. And did you, one of the questions that I kind of had about this was, how do you think the possible misinformation such as the ineffective study of vaccines affect the public understanding of autism?
I think that it causes definitely a major scare, and specifically with the MMR vaccine, what happens with that is that research is still happening, I guess. In relation to autism is the Tylenol, the attribution of Tylenol to it. But there's just not a lot of data, and for back to MMR vaccine, they realized later that data that the scientists had published was actually, they had changed the numbers a little bit and made it look like a more causal relationship than it actually was by taking out some participants and doing some things like that. And that researcher actually lost his medical license as a result of that. But by then, everybody already heard that MMR causes autism. And so you can't pull back the trigger after things like that have exploded. So it causes a very detrimental effect to the public. And even now when people say, oh, well, vaccines are not associated, people still heard that at some point. And then there's also a little bit of source amnesia that comes with that, if you're familiar with that. It's whenever you hear something, you can remember that something that you heard, but you can't always remember where you heard it. And so even if I read it from a news source that I know is lying, I may still have that connection in my head, and I'll be like, oh, I think I heard that at some point. And I don't remember if my best friend told me that, or if I heard it from a good news source or a bad news source, but I heard that at one point. And so it has with your work environment, and so maybe we're not going to in-person meeting where there's everybody's doing things all around. It can be very overstimulating, and then, like I mentioned, uses of sarcasm and different phrases that maybe just don't make sense for some people. And so with moving online, I think that can be beneficial for some people with autism. But I mean, maybe there's others that it's not necessarily as beneficial for, but I think that it could help.
What do you see as the next steps within the workplace to start accommodating individuals with ASD? I know you mentioned some strategies, like how do you envision the workplace is going to evolve over the next 10 years or so? That's a kind of big question.
That's a really good question. And it's very hard to say because, I mean, there's so many directions it can go into. You can never predict the future with great accuracy. But I do think, I would hope that more people would come to an understanding of what neurodivergency is, because I feel like right now we hear neurodivergence, and everyone's kind of like, ugh, I don't want to hear about all of that unnecessary drama that we're causing the workplace, the DEI, it's just like, a lot of people shy away from that kind of thing. But I would hope that people would learn to appreciate what these things are for what they actually are, rather than listening to misinformation, and really just coming to an understanding of what their peers need. And so I would hope that workplaces would become more accommodating, especially at the individual level, because that's sort of what I'm advocating for my paper, is that employers need to understand what each employee specifically would need that could help them, as it is such an individual thing.
One more.
You mentioned motor neurons as a possible correlates with ASD. Is that like something that they're doing a ton of research on right now with the big focus, or is that just like one possibility that's out there?
That's one possibility that's out there. And in my research, it seems like one of the most promising, as I mentioned, but there's no way of knowing, like, oh, this is going to be it. This is like what's happening. This is what's behind autism. And like I mentioned, it's so different for each person. And that's what they found in genetic studies too. Is, well, this gene right here applies to 50% of people with autism, but what about the other 50? And so we just don't know what's causing it in everyone. And so maybe it'll be one answer for some things that are happening for some symptoms of autism, but there's no way of knowing if it's going to be the definite answer for us.
Thank you very much, Allison. Appreciate it.
Next up is going to be Halle. You're talking about zebrafish? All right, the uses of zebrafish in medical research. So let's welcome her.
Everyone, thank you for coming tonight, and thank you, Allison, for your presentation. I always love listening to you. As you all already know, I'm talking about zebrafish, and if you've been to any of my other honors presentations, you would know before that I'm going to be talking about zebrafish. That's what I've done all my research on them. But tonight it's going to be a little bit different. Instead of talking about robotoxin and red tide, I wanted to talk about human disease research. And how the zebrafish model is applied to that. It was first used in scientific research in the 1930s, and then by 2003, so a little bit later, its entire genome has been sequenced, and approximately 70% of human genes are shared with zebrafish, which makes this an incredible opportunity for human disease research. It became widely applied in the 21st century, particularly in neurobiology studies, but most recently have been used in evolutionary research. And that's due to their rapid growth and their they're super reproductive, so they're high fecundity. They're also being used to study the most researched disease among humans, which is cancer. They have the ability to regenerate their organs, including their heart, their extremities, and even normal cells. This aspect is currently being investigated in multiple cardiovascular studies, which I'll get into a little bit later, which makes them a very powerful model for understanding these human diseases. So first up is cancer. One of the a common challenge in cancer research is finding a reliable method for tumor evaluation. So researchers are looking for alternative strategies for cancer treatment. Many are now using zebrafish to test patient-derived xenografts, which in its process tumor cells or more tissue from humans are being taken out of them and implanted into zebrafish hosts. The embryos and the larvae of zebrafish are transparent, so it makes it super easy for researchers to observe the tumor development and to see the drug response within them and also cell evasion. They have an effective implantation rate of up to 95% for this process, which is much higher than any mammal models used in cancer research. The most common cancer type within the central nervous system is glioma. Some glioblastomas, which is the most aggressive form of this type of cancer, it can be fatal despite only spreading within brain tissue and it doesn't go to other organs. Research teams have transplanted GBM cells, glioblastoma cells, into zebrafish to observe the development. The Promises tool allows for the observation and assessment of aggressiveness and prediction of evasion for a person's specific type of tumor, which will lead to a more accurate prognosis for them. Many strategies and drugs tested using zebrafish must go through more rigorous testing and multiple animal models before they can be truly beneficial, but this is one way they can gain an immediate advantage. These zebrafish PDX multiplication drugs derived xenotypes are also used to test cancer drugs and strategies. Since they develop most of the same organs as mammals, they can be strong models for these drug screens. The embryos have successfully found, researchers using embryos have successfully found a potential compound for cancer treatment. T-cell leukemia is caused by the uncontrollable growth of immature T cells, which are part of your white blood cells, which are your disease or infection fighting cells. A compound by the name of Lendovar was found to destroy these immature T cells without affecting any of the other cell cycles or types around it. The zebrafish that were treated with this compound went into remission after receiving treatment, which makes this very promising. But it must continue testing in animal models, specifically mammals, before it ever makes its way into human trials, of course. And then moving on to neurodegenerative diseases, which one that particular we'll talk about later with Sarah. But the most common one is Alzheimer's disease. And a study was done in which 3 different flavonoids, which are the pigment found in plants, were tested on zebrafish with the use of novel object recognition tests, tank guiding tests, and blind quizzes. The zebrafish were induced into Alzheimer's by a drug called scopolamine in order to test the drugs on them. And following the trials, the zebrafish were euthanized in order to dissect their brains and reveal information about how these 3 flavonoids impacted their cognitive abilities, their anxiety levels, and gene expression throughout the tests. Fred1 protein levels were also analyzed with the hopes of memory improvement. This is just one of the proteins that's a working part to help regulate your gene expression. And then all 3 of these flavonoids reveal anxiolytic properties, which means just less anxiety, success in reversing the degradation of spatial and recognition memory, and potential benefits on the central nervous system. Statistically significant research is showing that antioxidants have an advantageous effect on frequently encountered diseases. And while brain development in zebrafish is unlike human development in most ways, dopaminergic projections within the forebrain are believed to function similar to the reward system within mammals. These are just the neural pathways that use dopamine to send signals. They also have brain regions consistent with the hippocampus and the amygdala, with the primary purpose of learning, memory, and emotional behavior. A neurodegenerative disease called Parkinson's disease involves the loss of dopaminergic neurons and causes motor impairment. Researchers have been unable to simulate this disease within mice. However, they have successfully generated it within zebrafish through gene knockout and chemical use, which creates opportunities without visualization within the transparent embryo and disease progression and potential for trials in search of a solution. Within cardiovascular disease, it's the most common cause of death in the world globally. And while much is known about cardiovascular diseases, there's still much to be explored and understood. But through gene modification, zebrafish are able to replicate human cardiovascular diseases for greater health. comprehension. Cardiomyopathy, which is a disease that makes it more difficult for your heart to pump blood, is just one disease that has been successfully developed in zebrafish models through the disruption of a gene. This caused severe structural defects and issues including tightening proteins. Sarcomeres are contractile units of a muscle, and tightening proteins are the spring in conjunction with sarcomeres. These models can be used in preclinical studies and possible drug discovery for those suffering from heart failure. Researchers working with zebrafish are also contributing to the investigation of heart tissue regeneration by determining its molecular markers. Zebrafish are producing new ways to explore diseases with greater potential to replicate cancer than humans. Now, if you've been to my other talks, you know most of my work has been with toxicology, so I have to add a little bit of that into. They're very well-documented for toxicology research that they're cost-effective, ethically advantageous, and can absorb chemicals in water. Chemical exposure can cause gene alteration during cardiotoxicity and neurotoxicity events. A group of researchers used an online genetic database called Consensus PATH-DB to determine interactions between upregulated and downregulated genes during these events. This information can now be used to help understand similar pathways and potential molecular players within humans. They're being used in multiple disease toxicology studies due to these unique features, along with developmental observation and genetic linkages. These approaches are used in neurocognitive and neuromuscular trials to observe activity after intoxication. They're not only used in human disease studies, but also implemented in environmental toxicology studies, which in turn relates back to humans. They've proven to be a versatile animal model for advancement in human disease research, with their allowing for visualization during tumor development, and they can produce observable results during drug screening. With neurodegenerative and cardiovascular research, they're able to model results similar to humans in order to investigate new therapeutic strategies and genetic manipulation. Toxicology opens up even more pathways for exploration of the application of the zebrafish model. While there are limitations within these studies, there seems to be no limit to the many different varieties of zebrafish used within research studies. And thinking of the way I can connect all of this research back to God, even though it sounds silly, there are always analogies to make within things, and thinking about the coolest aspect of the zebrafish is their organ regeneration, and how interesting that it is. It's an impressive design, it's a skill not found within our bodies, but we have it in a different body, in our spiritual body, where we can find restoration of our soul through Christ, which leads us to eternity, not within our physical body, but with this opportunity to rebuild our spiritual after brokenness, to become whole and eternity within Him.
Let's start with David and work our way down.
Thinking through the reason using zebrafish is you get an advantage in both because they are I think it was 70% something similar to human structure. Also, this is the transparency that makes them so effective. Is the reason for the other animal studies because they're just that closer to direct relationship to like we have something that see it as a fish and then they go to another animal, what's this one? Model, another animal model, and then before moving on to study in humans, is that because the next animal model is even closer to humans, and you couldn't start because of the transparency advantage?
That is correct for the most part. A lot of people use zebrafish mostly because it's way easier to do it ethically. They look at mammals, and then going from that, while they do have most of the organs that humans do, animals are way closer. Like the zebrafish are very, very sensitive. They have all of that function with them, but it is closer in an animal.
Because zebrafish are able to regenerate really quickly, do you think that they're going to be able to be used to develop personalized medicines where each of those can be tested rapidly for individualized treatments?
I think that's kind of where we're going with it, especially with the implementing the specific tumor cells within zebrafish. That actually does get an idea of the specific how it's going to react within the human. But I'm not sure how far it can go with that can lead to potentially finding a treatment.
When we talk about toxicology, I think something that's just in pop culture now that comes to my mind is like microplastics. Is there a bit of research about microplastics with zebrafish? There's like a lot of information out there. We can kind of really how it affects zebrafish and other brains.
To be honest, I've not read anything about microplastics. A lot of my research has been chemically focused, like solutions that are dissolved in water, molecularly, but that's very interesting to talk a little bit about.
I thought it was interesting how they're using zebrafish to study neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's, and how accurately can that really your
It is really hard to say exactly, which is why these are just studies that they're doing to try and find out and real more information that they haven't found yet. And so it's really just like a starting point. And so after, when they find this information, that's when they take it and they go into something else and then they bring what they learned with them and try and apply it in a different way, maybe a different animal model or a different tweak something within a strategy and see how it actually just like, this is the beginning kind of.
And then you talk about treatments that require a lot of tests to be able to use. But are there any like at least good understandings that come from these zebrafish studies that we can apply more readily?
The biggest thing are those patient-derived xenografts, which is you can immediately see, since you can develop so quickly as embryos, you can see that tumor growth, you can see how the drugs work within them, you can see how the cell can be other cells, and that's like, rapid uses that can be applied back to humans.
For cancer treatment, are those pneumoclasts? Are those the main ones that they can use, or are they focusing on a lot of different kinds of cancer tumor growth?
They are focusing a lot more on just the glioblastomas. I did a paper about breast cancer and I did a paper about liver cancer, and so it's more than just the nervous system, but they're taking all of the different types and they're trying to apply them within the zebrafish and see what they can find.
Are there any major communities against testing on zebrafish specifically?
That is one of the big beneficial parts of using zebrafish. No one really seems to have like a big problem with it. Compared to like dog testing or cat testing or any other type of animal, they are used super widely just because mostly they're cost effective and because they're ethically they're easy. Like so I haven't read anything about people having like issues with that.
Neurodegenerative diseases, or are their genomes constantly disrupted to the neurology?
It's not a natural, it's not something natural within zebrafish, it is within the genome. There's different like genomic lines of zebrafish, so you can get a zebrafish who have been induced to have Alzheimer's or a zebrafish induced to have Parkinson's disease. They've already developed the zebrafish and knocked out genes or add something to create those models.
What's the timeline of like experimenting on zebrafish that we don't have animals? Like, once they like they have like a really process for them and you do the
I'm not sure of the exact 100% of the time we go, okay, it's time to see if this can be applied somewhere else.
Are there any links between regenerative properties and zebrafish and current status?
I think, yes, they were doing studies with the cardiovascular research, that is part of it, seeing how human stem cells will work within zebrafish, like see the growth and function, but I did not specifically look at that.
You know, there's been a lot of research trying to develop most of your presentations on zebrafish, and I know you're also graduating soon. Do you see yourself continuing in this kind of research?
That's a great question. I did at first. I came here like looking to do some kind of botanical research or marine research, and so that's kind of what got me into this. But now I've completely shifted, and it's not really my interest anymore. But I'm excited about it, and I think that it will lead to great things.
When you research the toxicology specifically, can you find any advances in medicine for that specific
I haven't seen anything specific like that, especially with the rototoxin research we've been doing, how it can cause issues within the gastrointestinal system of humans and it can cause neurodegenerative issues. There has been no kind of solution out of that, so I haven't seen anything in the research that I've looked into.
I'm just kind of curious, sort of along some of the other like progression questions, but have there been any drugs that maybe don't work or these already down the line now that started with this zebrafish and stuff like this, or at least get on that and see if it works whatever like on next?
I'm not aware of anything, but considering that they've been used since the early 1900s, I would assume there is one, but I can't say for sure. It's the one compounds, the linalocar, that kills the T cells which is promising for leukemia. I don't think that there have been trials yet within animals. It just started in the zebrafish, but there's one that might come out soon, so we'll see how it goes.
How will responses to the different drugs affect zebrafish in the long term? Specifically, it's like what I'm thinking of is the zebrafish lifespan is about 3 years, is that right? So like how do you see that correlating or like I guess kind of transitioning over to we test on 3-year lifespan, going to the lifespan like a human like that?
Good answer, Lorna. This is what you're asking. In a lab setting, or a lab setting, or like out in the wild?
I guess it's the last setting.
Okay, in a lab setting, I'm going to be honest, they will allow me to get readers in most laboratories, unless that is like the main focus, to see like the lifespan and how it changes with, say, a different or a different kind of disease. But most zebrafish who are already in something are either die from it accidentally, or maybe they're given too high a dose and die that way, or they are euthanized to be dissected so we can do what's going on in our bodies.
My second question is really effectively answered by your presentation. Those are the questions, but I was just saying this particular paper, especially looking back at your other papers, helping me understand a lot more about just in general what it was. So I wondered what you've done to study all of that. So I think you can understand it a lot better now.
Any questions from the other presenters? Got anything from the audience?
How do you see this affecting individuals later on? Like, if you were to take an embryo of a lion fish and inject it with somebody's disease, whether cancer or any being able to effectively treat an individual more based off of that individual research.
Yes, that is pretty much exactly what everyone can do, so it's interactive for us. Picking themselves, seeing how to go, and using different drugs to see how it reacts. So definitely like exactly like to specific patients.
Anyone else? Anything else? All right, thank you very much. Next up, we've got Sarah Scarboro, who's going to be working out. She's going to talk about rehabilitation and Parkinson's disease.
Actually, thank you all for coming out tonight and listening to all of our research and what we worked on this semester. We all really appreciate it. Tonight I want to talk to you guys about research I'm doing about a program called Allison, which is a physical therapy program for patients with Parkinson's disease. So to start with a little bit of background, Parkinson's disease is a progressive neurodegenerative disorder that directly affects motor function. It causes bradykinesia, which is slower movements, hyperkinesia, which is smaller movements, and directly affects difficulty in remembering to use larger and more purposeful movements in daily life. So some common motor symptoms include rigidity, slowness, tremor, and altered postural reflex. These symptoms all contribute to an overall loss of function, gait impairment, and overall decreased quality of life. These impairments have a neurological basis and result from a loss of dopamine-secreting neurons in the motor circuits of the basal ganglia, which play a crucial role in control and coordination of movement. This dopamine deficiency disrupts the ceiling of movement amplitude, causing individuals to produce smaller movements that they perceive as normal. The primary treatments for Parkinson's disease are medication and surgery, which mainly provide symptomatic relief and still leave the patient with impairments in mobility, balance, and reduced quality of life. So there's plenty of evidence that physical therapy is an integral part of Parkinson's disease treatment, specifically when focusing on gait training, balance, and fall prevention as hallmark interventions. I'm looking to pursue a career in physical therapy, hopefully, so that is kind of what sparked this research for me, and specifically with this program, I was able to observe a PT last year that was implementing this program, so this is kind of what sparked the interest. So LSPT Big is an evidence-based intervention that enhances motor performance, functional mobility, and overall quality of life in individuals with Parkinson's disease through amplitude-based movement training. So a little bit of background on this program. The LSPT part stands for Lee's Silverman Voice Treatment. So it did start as a program are now applied to the BIG program, which can be used by physical and occupational therapists. It focuses on high amplitude movements and is characterized by multiple repetitions, high intensity, and increasing complexity. This program targets dopamine deficiency by retraining the sensory motor system through exaggerated high amplitude movement repetition. Repeated activation of motor regions encourages cortical reorganization and supports neuroplasticity, helping restore more automatic and efficient movement patterns. So certified LSPT BIG therapists use verbal cues, feedback, and task modifications to help patients refine and generalize improved movement patterns into everyday activities. These cueing strategies help patients to focus attention to producing big movements, which helps them counteract the effects of bradykinesia and hyperkinesia. This therapy is delivered in 1-hour therapy sessions 4 times a week for 4 weeks in a row. So participants in this program maintain one-on-one training with a PT or OT. Each session is structured by repetitive full body exercises, which are usually broken down into functional tasks, hierarchical tasks, gait training, and carryover tasks that are used to encourage them to use them in their everyday life. The structure of this treatment promotes neuroplasticity through intensity, repetition, and specificity. A growing body of research supports the effectiveness of this program in improving motor outcomes for patients with Parkinson's disease. A study by Matsuno et al. Found significant increases in gait speed and stride length following LSPT BIG training. This was measured using a wearable gait analysis system called Gait. Participants also demonstrated increased range of motion in hip flexion and extension, which contributed to improved gait patterns. LSPT BIG requires patients to try to consistently move with greater force and amplitude than normal, which enhances overall muscle strength, stride length, gait speed, and hip range of motion, as we can see in the study. In multiple studies, improvements have been assessed through the outcome of the Unified Parkinson's Disease Rating Scale. The UPDRS is a tool used to measure the severity and progression of Parkinson's disease. Specifically, Part 3 of this assessment is considered the gold standard for assessing motor symptoms in Parkinson's disease. A study by Eichorn et al. Compared LSPT BIG with other physical therapy programs for Parkinson's disease and found that the participants of this program exhibited greater improvements in motor scores, gait velocity, and balance. The primary outcome of the study was a change in the UPDRS motor score from baseline to follow-up. The Parkinson's disease questionnaire is also used in a lot of studies, mainly to evaluate quality of life in Parkinson's disease patients. A study by Eichorn found a statistically significant decrease in several measures from this questionnaire, including mobility, activities of daily living, emotional state, stigma, cognition, communication, physical discomfort, and general health scores after the LSPT BIG program. A study by Flood et al. Used accelerometry measured by body-worn sensors to examine motor function in patients before, during, and after LSPT BIG therapy. They found that this program produced an increase in gait speed, and as shown by improved results in the 10-meter walking test and the tug test. The 10-meter walking test is used to evaluate gait speed over a distance of 10 meters, and the time of the go test is used to evaluate functional mobility, balance, and fall rates by timing how long it takes for the patient to stand up, walk 10 feet, turn, and walk back, and sit down. The study also found improvements in functional mobility as observed by the stand task. This task involves standing for the seated position repeatedly and is designed for testing leg strength and endurance. The study concluded that the stretching and stepping exercises involved in the LSPT BIG treatment enhance the speed and amplitude relationship that is disproportionately scaled by Parkinson's disease. A study by Walter et al. Also found improvements in non-motor systems after this training. Specifically, they found that the participants of this program had increased scores in the geriatric depression scale, as well as gait, balance, endurance, and functional task performance. LSPT has also shown promise in increasing dual task performance, which is a critical factor in fall prevention. They found that participants demonstrated improved performance on both tug motor and tug cognitive tests. Through the study, a reduction in dual task interference was observed as a result of this intervention. They concluded that the ability to perform two tasks simultaneously was correlated with quality of life as well as safety in patients with Parkinson's disease. The outcomes measured seen in the study showed the effectiveness of this program for these patients. We can see through this research that LSPT is an effective program, but there are still several barriers that can limit access to treatment for several patients. Some of these being treatment frequency, program costs, and geographic limitations that may restrict participation. A study by Halle, Eichorn, explored telerehabilitation delivery of LSPT and found that there were improvements in balance and activity coordination. Continued motivation and home exercise is a big part of this program. And there's definitely still more need for research in the use of telehealth, but it could stand as a valid option for keeping accountability with patients in this program. Most studies on LSPT had smaller sample sizes and shorter follow-up durations, so this kind of limits the understanding of the long-term efficacy of the treatment right now. Research in this area also often focuses on the moderate stages of Parkinson's disease, which is identified usually as on a scale as 1-yard rate 1 through 3. Which leaves a gap in this knowledge about the effectiveness of LSPT for advanced Parkinson's disease. Furthermore, there is limited research that uses a control group or alternate exercise program for comparison. And both of these allow researchers to generalize their findings and produce stronger, more significant results. Future studies should investigate how to sustain long-term gains following LSPT, including the potential benefits of ongoing community classes or maintenance sessions after treatment. Early intervention studies are also needed to determine whether introducing LSPT soon after diagnosis could slow the disease progression and preserve independence longer. Parkinson's disease presents profound challenges to motor control, independence, and overall quality of life. While medication and surgical interventions can manage symptoms, they do not address the underlying motor deficiencies that come along with this disease and how it affects movement, amplitude, and coordination. LSPT is a powerful, evidence-based approach to improving mobility, function, and quality of life. This treatment directly targets sensory motor deficiencies caused by this disease by emphasizing high amplitude, intensive, and repetitive movements. Research consistently supports the effectiveness of LSPT in enhancing gait speed, functional mobility, balance, and activities of daily living. This program also empowers patients to take an active role in rehabilitation. This helps them to move with intention, confidence, and greater autonomy in their daily life. 1 Corinthians 6:19-20 states, "Don't you know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit who is in you, whom you have from God? You are not your own, for you are bought at a great price, so glorify God with your body." As Christians, we're called to be good stewards of our body, for they were created to glorify God. I believe that rehabilitation is an opportunity to glorify God by taking care of our bodies and maintaining our health. There is an ongoing need for more research in LSPT treatment to ensure more patients can benefit from this amplitude-based approach to physical therapy. But we can see that LSPT is an effective therapeutic intervention that enhances motor performance and restores quality of life for people living with Parkinson's disease. Thank you. independence and feeling like they're losing the ability to do things by themselves. And that continues to take away confidence too. So that's a big part of this program too, is just to help them build back up their confidence again. But yeah.
Is LSU big? Do you want to put people with mental health disease? Is there different physiological conditions due to age?
I'm not exactly sure about that. I know a lot of the studies I looked at had were mainly focused in an age range of like later stages, like 60s and 70s too. So I'm not sure if there's a difference in that for sure. But that definitely is a consideration because earlier on, overall the program talks about it's better to start implementing it early on because no matter what age you are, it's going to have better effects early on. So I think that's kind of a little
You mentioned how they perceive smaller actions require talking as normal. So does this kind of big, loud movements seem excessive to them? Or is it like, is it more uncomfortable? Or is it like, oh, this is normal too?
Yeah. I think it's definitely uncomfortable at first. And that was kind of in the description of this program, like from the official websites and stuff. And it's supposed to be exaggerated and uncomfortable and probably really weird. But that's a part of this kind of recalibration of like trying to create these new neural pathways that are refocusing you on thinking day. And that's a big part of like the verbal cues is everything's done like reach up day, reach down day, like everything's day. Then that happens through repetition. But it definitely does seem crazy at first, but the exaggeration is kind of what makes it stand out and helps us remember it.
So what is the effectiveness of LSBT say about the role around plasticity and delaying the progression of neurodegenerative diseases?
Yeah, I think it definitely shows that it is possible to kind of fight against these diseases, even though there's not an overall cure. And that is something that there's still ongoing research on, is that how exactly you can't just slow the onset of it, just in different ways that we can fight against this disease. But I think overall, it definitely shows the effects of exercise and movement, and that it does have an impact on neurodegenerative diseases. So.
What is this program? Is there a poster plan? Does it mention that the effects last longer than just
Yeah. So there's several things. There are kind of homework videos that they use during the treatment. During 4 weeks they're doing it. They also do after exercises when they can. But those videos apply after the treatment too, that they can keep up with. It's also, I believe, possible to schedule appointments with a therapist if you need to, kind of just to keep those reminders and just keep ongoing somewhat with the community. Also, they have community-based programs too, where there's groups of people doing it too. So that seems to be one of the most beneficial things right now, just because of accountability and everything. But there's several things in place for active therapy too.
I'm just interested in like how the neurological setup affects the body. So is there like does LSBT somehow have an effect on the dopamine levels in the brain of that kind of circuit, or is it more about just muscular, just having muscular deficiency with having more muscle?
Yeah, I am not exactly sure about that, and the exact pathology of it is not exactly known, but almost every single study I read pointed out the facts about, okay, well, these symptoms are caused by this dopamine deficiency, and they all highlight that by completing this training, and especially the repetition and high intensity part of it, you're attempting to kind of reframe those neural pathways. I don't But that's something that most of them explain, and there's definitely still research going on about that, because it's not completely limited, but these are your questions.
To go on that, or my question kind of goes alongside that. What's the difference between dopamine as part of the brain reward system between versus kind of how we see it in the local place in Parkinson's?
Yeah, most of the studies I was reading just mainly point out that these dopamine secreting neurons, they play a role in control and coordination of movement. I don't really know the complete difference of that. I didn't really get into that in my research, but that definitely is interesting to think about though, because in the different roles of things. So.
Do you think that clearly these studies work to counteract a lot of it? Do you think that these studies are going to be effective? Like you mentioned, obviously it needs to go further. But where do you think maybe this is going to be able to go in terms of getting to a cure or something almost like a cure? I'm thinking of two men in my life who both both are very active, both receive Parkinson's, and they have two very different. One of them is down to Eric, the other, he had it for several years before he even revealed to most people that he had it, and nobody else. So it's just thinking about that difference. They were both active, and so I'm curious where you think this would lead to.
Yeah. I think that things like this definitely prove to be effective programs for, as I already mentioned, it's going to have more effectiveness if it's started early on. But from what I've seen also, I know that the pathology of Parkinson's disease and how it progresses can look different for different people too. And I don't know what causes that. I don't really know if we do it at all. It can just be different for different people depending on their makeup or genetics or whatever. But I definitely think this research shows that exercise is an important part, especially early on. But other lifestyle factors that can have an effect too. And this isn't meant as a stop the medication thing. It's just meant as this is another way of treatment and all that too.
I just wonder if the LSBD versus physical therapy does involve kind of perception and the mental aspect of, hey, this is not a normal amount of buzz or a normal amount of movement. They kind of go through that with the patient as well as the physical exercise.
Yeah, for sure. The verbal hearing part of it, and kind of just the mindset part of it. Like as I was reading through much information about it, especially on the actual LCT website, they kind of have this day-to-day principle, and they're this because the training is very specified to each patient. So, but it just falls under this principle of day-to-day. So it's a little different for everyone. But yes, that's kind of how it differs from normal physical therapy. Other PT things that have been applied to Parkinson's patients don't focus on the verbal hearing as much. So I think that's something that sets this program apart for sure.
What does the training qualification process look like for a therapist who uses this?
Yeah, I know that it's a separate certification process, part of just ongoing education and everything. The therapists I've had just completed it for Ash Schreiber, and basically I think she went into the training, but it's kind of like a certification where it takes maybe 1 or 2 weeks to 2 or 3 weeks of obtaining it, and then it's kind of a license that you can have it off that. It's kind of the little.
I was wondering if LSBT has become more standardized in very recent years, or if it's still seen as a new practice in institute research.
Yeah, the research has been going on about 25 years as of right now. The lab program was around before then, and this is derived from that. So it's definitely becoming more standard. When the therapist I shadowed was doing it, she had all of her materials, a very strict set of things she was following. It was something you're just coming up with off the dome. So it definitely is a more established practice, but there's just a lot of areas that still need research that could just kind of boost the effectiveness of it. Kind of like I mentioned about just getting bigger studies, also just more comparison groups so that the research is stronger too. Yeah, I'm not exactly sure about that. That wasn't really mentioned, and I don't think there's been any research done in that way that like tests to see if it could happen at that even before or during the onset. So I'm not really sure about that, but it definitely would be interesting to know that. I mean, I know that exercise is good no matter what. It's supposed to be part of our daily lives anyways, and with that, again, like someone says that some things are inevitable, so they're still going to happen, that would be interesting to research about for sure.
Any questions?
Yes.
In Parkinson's, specifically with studies regarding how patients still can maintain fluidity and movement is typically with practice, movements that they've done a lot. So if a dancer gets Parkinson's when they dance, it is not with germs or something because of that neural pathway that's already there. So do you think that it could also be a place for, alongside this big work, but also trying to implement pathways and mental aspects to the things that you learn, kind of like the verbal reinforcement, and there's obviously the verbal reinforcement to actually becoming, but adding the mental aspect to it because that can create that mental pathway where there aren't triggers during those essential tasks, those small things that you do that good.
Yeah. I think specifically what you're talking about with being familiar with a task, that is kind of a part of the program, is that the patient and the therapist set specific goals to what they're wanting to improve in, either in what they're struggling with or what they do in their daily life, even what their hobbies are, so that they can keep living in that way. So that's kind of more than half of the exercises is completely focused on what this patient wants to achieve. Because I agree with you that I think it definitely is going to motivate them more and have more effectiveness if it's something you're familiar with, and also have a mental connection to with it for sure.
Was there anything in your research that talked about like the positive impact of like psychological benefits of having that purpose that they're able to implement that?
Yeah, for sure. There's some studies going into, like there was one that I mentioned that specifically included the depression as one of the factors that they researched, and there were significant results from that and improving. So that's kind of an area that's expanding too, is the mental health improvements, but there is research out there. And it's kind of one of those things that as the motor function improves and independence, then mental health is going to improve too, because those things are highly related, and as one decreases the other thing, decreases in
Any other questions? All right, thank you, Sarah. Luke Eichorn is going to talk to us about the enzymes and taking a moment to set up his technology. When you need to stand up, stretch your legs, feel free. Just take a moment to do this.
So the next presentation was Eichorn, going to talk to us about the end times, and we've got some uplifting pictures. We're going to look at some
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for all coming out. Pretty fitting that I'm going last, because talking about eschatology, which is the doctrine of the last times. Thank you, Dr. Chilko, for hosting us tonight. So, eschatology is defined as the doctrine of the last times, yet the disagreements concerning it originate with this very definition. Various eschatological frameworks have approached this question differently and have proposed many different answers during this discussion. Tonight, I'd like to talk about kind of eschatology, which propounds the idea of fulfilled prophecy known as realized eschatology. In realized eschatology, the last time is the time between the death of Jesus and the fall of Jerusalem, which is depicted in this painting. More specifically within this eschatology, I researched theological consequences of realized eschatology. So I'd like to argue that realized eschatology's emphasis on the present fulfillment, present and past fulfillment of prophetic hope unites a reinterpretation of core Christian doctrines, which results in the diminished significance of final judgment, resurrection of the world church, and the eschatological hope of the second coming of Jesus. Okay, so let's get some semantics out of the way. There are multiple different terms which are used to refer to realized eschatology, and the primary ones are realized eschatology, covenant eschatology, transmillennialism, and full preterism. I'll be using these four terms interchangeably throughout the presentation, and they just refer to different aspects of realized eschatology. Okay, so here's the thesis of realized eschatology. Christ's coming with all Jerusalem is the fulfillment of all things written and spoken by the prophets of God. So, the key figures in the history of realized eschatology, first there was J.S. Russell in the late 80s, who began the idea of realized eschatology and established an emphasis on all Jerusalem in 1870. Then C.H. Dodd in the mid-1900s, he created the term realized eschatology and advanced it further along than J.S. Russell had. Finally, most recently, there's Max King, who really popularized the eschatology. His book, The Spirit of Prophecy, is most likely the most influential piece of realized eschatological literature. So here's the timeline of realized eschatology. So the death of Christ in 1833 began the millennium prophesied about in Revelation. Then in 1870, the fall of Jerusalem happened, and the parousia, or the second coming of Jesus, began at the time. And it depends on who you ask, which realized eschatologist you ask, but either time continues eternally, or there is an unprophesied about, unknown end time which will happen in the future. So, the beginning of the proposition of realized eschatology introduces the first innate law. It is a hypothesis. King claims the notion in the Spirit of Prophecy within the first few dozen pages. I would argue that the New Testament does not be proof of hypotheses. Paul claims in 2 Thessalonians, so that brethren, stand firm and hold to the tradition which were taught, whether by word or by mouth or by letter from us. Paul's words in his epistles do not be affirmed of hypotheses and refuse those who introduce new ideas into his teachings. As well, historic denominations have never professed realized eschatology before Russell's introduction in the 1800s. The views typically range from amillennialism to premillennialism. I would also argue that inaugurated eschatology, the idea of the already but not yet, acts as a hermeneutical tool, not a hypothesis. It is merely a way of reconciling different eschatological doctrines rather than introducing new doctrines such as eschatology does. Okay. We get into the exegetical methodology of realized eschatology. It can be described as inconsistent at best. Often in the works of C.H. Dodd, he chooses preferable gospel accounts and throws away the other gospels entirely. He even often amounts to preferring the theorized Q gospel, which there are no found manuscripts. So here's basically the interpretive formula of realized eschatology: accept Scripture when it agrees, and deny or explain away Scripture when it disagrees. The process of selection in biblical eschatology is a rather difficult subject matter in general, as the New Testament never sought to create systematic eschatology, and thus no his selection of scripture texts is obviously motivated by the desire to make a case for theology, but in the process he ignores many scriptures which contradict it. Let's see that. So here's the core and the crux of realized eschatology, the aspect of covenant eschatology. So it's called covenant eschatology because of its emphasis of compression of prophecy to the Mosaic age, focusing on the covenant, on the Old Covenant. This compression effectively leaves no prophecy left over for the current Messianic age due to its engorgement of all prophecy. I would argue that this interpretation implicates direct consequences for the modern church. Consequences of future hope, resurrection, final judgment, and dispossession of eschatological truth. So according to Halle's eschatology, Judaism was defined as a decaying body which was in need of a cleansing judgment, and this ultimately culminated in the genesis of Christianity. According to King, Israel and Judaism during the time of Jesus had become the throne of Satan, and they acted as, quote, Satan's instruments for deceiving the nations, end quote. Much of this foundation rested on Israel's misconstrued messianic misconceptions. They often believed that the Jewish kingdom should have been a fully powerful kingdom which reigned and held dominion over the entire world. So, in covenant eschatology, the traditional cosmic struggle between Christ and Satan is reframed as a transitional period between old and new covenants. This puts the entire emphasis of the parousia on the judgment against apostate Israel and the termination of the law of Moses, and thus there is no Christian eschaton. For Max King, in his Spirit of Prophecy, quote, the New Testament is not yet taken from Israel's eschaton and turned into a Christian eschaton. The fullness of Israel, like the fullness of Christianity, is stripped of its meaning, time, and manner of fulfillment. From this perspective, in absolute sense, salvation is of the Jews. So, what are the implications of this on final judgment? So here's the dichotomy of judicial hope in the traditional interpretation. The assurance of justification for the saints and retribution reserved for the wicked. However, instead, under realized eschatology, final judgment was solely intended for the church of AD 70 and the non-believing sect of Jews. The fall of Jerusalem and destruction of the temple was no doubt a day of judgment, but the prophecies regarding judgment are not exhausted within this context. From Acts 10, quote, the separation of Christ confessing believers from disbelieving Jews was the main purpose of the judgment, which found its fulfillment in the Roman invasion and devastation of Palestine. So, this evokes a very important question. How is soul judged in the post-AD 70 era under realized eschatology? And I would argue that ideology simply delivers no good answer. There are remarkably little writings on this throughout all of the realized eschatologists that I've spoken about earlier. And so, basically, since there are no writings on, or almost no writings on this, there are two options. Either judgment is rendered theologically relevant for following generations, everyone has AD 70, or judgment was exhausted at the fall of Jerusalem. And I would argue that both of these mean that the doctrine is unable to account for the enduring eschatological hope of divine justice. The righteous become deprived of the eschatological hope that the wicked will one day face retribution, and that the righteous will be proven faithful on the final day of the Lord. Perhaps an even more important aspect of this eschatology is its interpretation of the resurrection of the dead. So in the Spirit of Prophecy, King creates a strong argument of the body of resurrection arguments. He interprets the traditional view as corporeal physical zombies arising from physical graves. And so when he's arguing against it, he's not even arguing against the traditional interpretation, which is the right interpretation, being the spiritual body of resurrection of individuals. So according to Halle's eschatology, resurrection is a symbol of a transition between two eons and two covenants, the old and the new. According to this interpretation, the church was metaphorically buried under the oppression of Judaism, then subsequently resurrected from the dead following the fall of Jerusalem. The difficulty with this perspective lies in its incongruence with the prophetic schema plainly articulated in the New Testament. This is both a corporate body view rather than an individual body resurrection. The corporate body view being the entire body of the church as a whole is resurrected rather than individuals being resurrected. So to argue against this, from Romans 6, for if you become united with him in the likeness of his death, certainly you shall also be in the likeness of his resurrection. Now, if we have died with Christ, we believe that we shall also live with him. So, in the first century, Judaism was an oppressive force only in physicality. Many Jews were indeed in opposition to first century gospel preachers in the church. However, they are never identified as the root cause of the necessity of the resurrection, symbolic or otherwise. The law of Moses gave way to the new covenant and did not suppress it. Jesus himself stated this in Matthew 5, where he says that he did not come to abolish the law of Moses, but to fulfill it. Yet the primary issue is more problematic. Christ actually died and actually physically rose from the dead. It is in this that the New Testament clearly states that we follow Christ. Christ is the first to be resurrected, the first to be glorified by God, the first to receive a new body. This is his method in which we will follow in the footsteps of Christ through bodily resurrection and glorification at the future eschaton. And so, by realizing eschatology robs modern believers of the bodily, spiritual resurrection in Christ. So, realizing eschatology warps the biblical exegesis and character of God. It rejects the eschatological hope of many core Christian doctrines, including extremely impertinent ones such as final judgment and the resurrection of the dead. So the theological consequences of this eschatology are dire, drastic, and wide-reaching, and thus the eschatology must be used as heretical. So why is this important today? This is relatively recent, in 2012, from a preacher up in Kentucky, Joe Price. This was arguably a little more than a curiosity around the fact that the 87 apostasy is alive and well in the Bowling Green area. It is not only a belief that is held by some locally, it is being actively taught and promoted by some among our brethren in this area. It is still being taught today in churches of Christ. I have talked with people who believe in this. And so, as Paul states in Ephesians 4, quote, we are no longer to be children, tossed here and there by waves and carried about by every wind of doctrine, by the trickery of men, by craftiness and deceitful scheming. So, the theological implications and necessary logical conclusions of realized eschatology deny primary Christian tenets taught by Jesus in the New Testament, and thus should not be seriously considered by informed and learned students of the Bible. Adhere to the apostolic traditions and the teachings of Jesus. Thank you.
All right, David?
Yeah, we mentioned in your paper that God pointed to the first and this believing what we've been talking about. What did you point to there? Is that just a claim that he says, and then where does he back it up with?
He backs it up with his interpretation of Scripture. He thinks that what Paul writes in is realized eschatology. So, like Paul originally established those churches and taught realized eschatology. He also knew that was what Jesus taught.
But it is not one of those specific church fathers.
No, because all the church fathers were either premillennial or amillennial.
I got a two-part question. How would you define amillennialism? Was mentioned in your paper, and
on this Tuesday night. We've got another honors evening coming up in a couple weeks. That'll be on Thursday. We hope you all can come on. Thank you all very much. Have a wonderful week.